Good afternoon, everybody. Just about afternoon, isn't it? Yeah, 1 o'clock. Welcome to this little workshop. Thank you very much, Camp YA, for having me. We're going to talk about poetry. Hopefully, it's going to be useful stuff if you're a poet or you're writing poetry. I tried to kind of settle on some stuff to do that will also help your prose as well. For any prose writers out there that have kind of sidled in to the poetry workshop by accident. Or because they fancied a bit of a change. So I kind of settled on. I was thinking, well, what to do for a workshop for 20 minutes or so of me waffling on and giving you a whole bunch of prompts that you can kind of take off and play around with later. And what to do that's going to be useful for kind of prose writers and poets alike. And I settled on the idea of objects. We all write about stuff, don't we? Objects, things. We can extend objects to places, landscape, all that kind of thing. One of the things that I find that ports across between poetry and prose really, really well, really easily, is just that an idea that I like to kind of refer to as this intense noticing, really, where you kind of your engagement with what you're describing is kind of you kind of go into that kind of micro level, really. And objects, kind of writing about objects, give us an opportunity to do that, really. I also think that I don't know. We can sometimes, as writers, particularly of YA, kind of get a bit too bogged down in plot, a bit too worried about plot in terms of what's happening. To me, I think it's a fine balance, isn't it, really, between plot and kind of the color that you use to kind of bring that plot to life. I think sometimes we do get too kind of carried away with plot sometimes. And what description does, what objects allow us to do, is to kind of slow things down a bit, and they also let the reader in. There's a reason, I think, why we talk about following a plot, and the reader follows the plot. Because we are following, we're passengers, aren't we, with plot? We don't get to kind of decide what happens. We're kind of watching things unfurl in front of us. Whereas with description, when we slow things down, that's when we can let the reader in. We can kind of let a bit of air, a bit of space. We can kind of into our writing. We can pause time, I guess, and we can let our readers in to kind of be part of the production, or the process rather, of creating this world in which our writing happens, really. Dialogue, for example, is a good is something that I think quite often dialogue can exclude readers, that we're just watching or listening to a dialogue unfurl. Whereas if we kind of replace some of that dialogue with silence, we can be, as readers, kind of complicit in creating that silence, where we share that silence. Whereas it's very hard for a reader to share in a dialogue, because it's happening between two people on the page, isn't it? It's not happening with us. So we kind of, I guess, objects allow your reader to collaborate a bit more with you, in terms of kind of creating the world around you. So I thought we'd kind of do some stuff on that, really. So on to objects. If you've got the kind of pre-release stuff for this workshop, that's absolutely brilliant. If not, I think Deb's going to put it in the chat in a minute, I think, or it's kind of on its way to you. But if you've got it handy, we're going to kind of go through it fairly chronologically, actually. I did try kind of playing around with screen shares and stuff earlier, but for some reason it wasn't. It was just sharing a blank screen, which is probably very poetic, but not particularly useful if you're trying to follow along what's going on. So we're going to start with a couple of poems by a guy called Francis Ponge, who was a French writer, kind of in the 19th century. And he's known as the poet of things, poet of objects, really. And a lot of poetry was just really intense description, visual descriptions of stuff, of objects. The two that we're going to look at today are a crate, a kind of market crates that you carry plums around in, I don't know, apricots, it's France. And he also kind of wrote about matches, match poem. He did a poem about kind of just various other stuff, really. And it's kind of he's very, just a really interesting poet to look at, really. He also used to cut up newspaper stories, kind of from the local newspaper, into kind of little 5 word or 5 line versions, almost like haiku, and he had created these little kind of surreal narratives, little miniature narratives, super miniature narratives, really, micro narrative, maybe, out of newspaper stories, that were really, really interesting. It's worth reading. But anyway, we're going to I start off by looking at Francis Ponge, this guy whose job was basically about the minute observations of everyday objects. So we're going to have a look at crate first of all. I'll give it a read for you. If you want to read along, you absolutely can. That's fine. But again, this guy's not really trying to do anything else apart from just describe stuff. But well, we'll talk about the but afterwards, shall we? This is Crate by Francis Ponge. Halfway between crib and cage, the French language puts crate, a simple slatted box for transporting those fruits that fall ill at the least lack of air. Built in such a way that it can be broken down effortlessly after use, they used twice. It is really more perishable than the delicatessen foodstuffs that it carries. On the corners of streets that lead to the markets, It gleams like white wood without wood's vanity, still very new and slightly surprised to find itself in this awkward position, having been thrown into the gutter without hope of retrieval. It remains a most likeable object, on whose fate we will not dwell for long. So that's the crate for you. What I like about that poem is just how simple it is, really, and just how almost without trying to do so, Ponge creates a bit of a character out of this crate. The object kind of comes to life in his, I don't know, his wordy grasp, I guess, in his wordy palm. We do kind of any poem that's kind of talks about things delicating, which is what mushrooms do when they break down and go all inky and horrible. Is always a winner for me as well. But just kind of by mentioning and just noticing a few things about this crate, we all of a sudden have everything else in. I don't know about you, but to me, I'm instantly in a French marketplace there. I can, it's the kind of the gutter that this crate is sitting in is slightly damp. There was rain that morning. That's kind of being dried out by the kind of mid-morning heat of the marketplace. I can hear the market callers in the background. I can smell the big kind of fromage kind of platters on the go and all that kind of stuff. And just from this crate, this kind of very simply described crate creates this really evocative place. So I guess exercise one, for when you've got a little bit of time later on, exercise one is just to take an everyday object um, and and see what comes out of all those narrative, possibilities that exist around this object. Once you've written your intensely detailed description, what are the kind of possible narratives that live around that, I guess? Like I said, for me, that French marketplace is whole. It's complete in my head just from this description of a crate. And just again, that intense noticing the wood, that it gleams like white wood without wood's vanity. I think is a great little line. Like wood, but without wood's vanity. I don't know if you kind of if you've seen these crates, but they're made of. It's almost like balsa wood. They're kind of made of, and it is like wood, without wood's vanity. It's a great description. Why is wood vain all of a sudden? But I don't know. Maybe it is. It makes me think of those old wine crates that you can kind of spend horrendous amounts of money on that you can use as shelves at home. That kind of that you keep the vineyards embossment kind of facing out towards you, that kind of thing. So anyway, exercise one then, yeah, is to just have a look at an everyday object, um, and kind of describe it in such a way that all those narrative possibilities kind of exist around the edge of it, and then perhaps you could even follow one of those. So on to more Ponge then. So Ponge kind of described these things, but he also, I think the more Ponge you read, the more you process here. And it kind of comes up more in the second poem we're going to have a look at, which is called The Match, by Francis Ponge again. And it goes like this. The fire made one body with the match, a living body with gestures, exaltation, a short life. The gases emanating from it flamed up, gave it wings and dresses, a body even, a moving, pitiful form. It was brief. The head alone is able to burst into flame, on contact with a hard reality, and then you hear the sharp noise of the starter. But as soon as it is on, the flame, in a straight line, quickly, and its sail lowered like the boat of a regatta, covers the little piece of wood, which, slightly veering, it leaves at the end a black as a priest. So what Pond was also doing in some of his writing is he's trying to look for what he called the visual equivalence between the language he's using and the object he's describing. And I think we can see it in Match, really, where he's trying to use sound as much as anything. Sound, but he also he's quite interested in meter, pacing, rhythm, all of those kind of writing techniques, all your toolkit stuff that you can kind of bring out and bring to the table when you're writing stuff. He's trying to get all of that to evoke this matchness, I suppose. To me, it's most clear as we kind of get towards the end of this poem, when he starts describing the flame. The flame in a straight line quickly and its sail lowered like the boat of a regatta covers the little piece of wood. Just that slightly longer sentence there, that slightly longer phrase that kind of almost, and we're quickly in the middle of it, to me kind of really evokes that flame kind of flaming up and kind of depleting along the kind of the match as it kind of as it moves along. And then again, just that intense noticing idea that when you do strike a match, when the flame moves along, it does veer slightly. The match does kind of like twist up a little bit. I tried this, and it does. Trust me, if you've never kind of struck a match and really watched it, it does twist up a little bit. Slightly veering, it leaves at the end as black as a priest. And again, the kind of the just the sound quality of black as a priest, that kind of really end stopped T, that kind of just that snuffed out little sound at the end there. So that kind of idea of visual equivalence is something else that Pond was really, really interested in. So I guess that's activity two, really, is to kind of do a poem on an object that where you're trying to seek that kind of visual equivalence, where you're trying to use all of those writerly techniques, all of your writer's toolkit to kind of to try to translate, I suppose, translate the kind of process of that this object goes through. And it is, I think, quite useful to kind of look at it as being a process. Ponge tends to build his poems around a kind of three-part structure. I mean, they're very small poems, but there's still a bit of a structure going on there. The first thing he does is describe the object, and then he talks about the object being in use, what it's like when it's being used, and then he always gives us a sense of after use, this kind of sense of what's the object doing when it's no longer doing the function of that object, I suppose. It will be kind of, there's almost a, I don't know, like a dying fall at the end of his poems. This kind of sense that these poems just kind of peter out and leave us with this discarded thing at the end, whether it be a crate or a match or whatever else he's writing about. So exercise two then, yeah, have a crack at writing your objects, but trying to use all those aspects of language to translate the object into language, that visual equivalence, for what's going on there. So we're about halfway through, I'd say, before we kind of do some chatting and that kind of stuff, and we have some Q&A at the end. We're going to move on to someone who was a good friend of mine, actually, who was really into Ponge. She a lot of Vic Shirley's poetry is kind of built on Ponge's ideas, really. And this kind of really pushes that idea of how objects can create narrative. Vic's a bit of a surrealist, say a bit of, she's a huge surrealist. And so this was a bit of a weird poem, but fun nonetheless, and a good one for kind of playing around with. This is Vic Shirley's "I Fell in Love with a Braun Electric Shaver." Great piece of technology to fall in love with, I'd say. So let's give it a read, shall we? I fell in love with a Braun Electric Shaver. I know what you're thinking, and sure, I'm married, but you didn't see the way this shaver was looking at me, the way it would hum longingly whilst gliding over my husband's face, always vibrating, it seemed to me, in my direction. Made me feel kind of special. And this little guy was a Series 7, so unbelievably smart. The way they interpret the beard and adapt to a man's face. I didn't believe that was possible. Once you see a thing like that in action, you can't exactly unsee it, if you know what I mean. And once I discovered that it shared my love of French cinema, there was no going back. So, object poem with a bit of a twist, I suppose. So, there's a kind of, what I love about Vic's poem is there's a kind of, she takes that idea of the kind of confessional poem, that we're kind of confessing about falling in love with an electric shaver, and the scandal that might come out of that. But there's also a kind of sense of there's a kind of bragging confidence to it as well, which I really enjoy. And there's a tone of voice which we'll talk about in a second, that I find really interesting. So exercise three then is to fall in love with an object. So we've described them in minute detail. We've tried to make our language kind of reflect the kind of qualities and the sounds and the shape of the objects. This time, I fall with some. So if an object, an everyday object, now I try and stay away from objects we all fall in love, like photographs or something like that. Something that's so mundane and boringly everyday that you don't notice it every day. I don't know, a toaster, a doorbell, a spoon rest in your kitchen, a coaster, something like that. Bring that same kind of level of intense noticing to this one. But be specific about what it is you love about it. What does this object do? The way that it cradles your coffee, or the way that I don't know, the cutlery rack in the dishwasher. Why would you love the cutlery rack in the dishwasher? So organized, so neat, everything in its right place. I don't know if you're one of the people. Do you keep the nests down at the top so you can put the kind of spoon handles in, or do you just kind of let it all hang out? Is it a kind of random chaotic mess in there, like my dishwasher cutlery rack? Or maybe you've got one of those little drawer ones at the very top of your dishwasher. Anyway, or your draining rack cutlery holder. any kind of cutlery holding device is allowed here. But yeah, so see if you can fall in love with it. Again, keep it light, keep it fun. Think about tone. I mean, looking at Vic's work, I mean, like I said, she's gone for this kind of proud, bombastic, kind of semi-confessional, semi-bragging tone. But you know, you could be secretive. You could be kind of ashamed of your love for your cutlery holder. Or do you want to go kind of really push the whole pride thing, and kind of be completely in love with it, in that regard? And that's your kind of, that's activity three, to have a go at falling in love with an object. And then we will move on to activity four. And Caroline Bird, who's this poem comes from Caroline's fifth collection, The Air Year. Her previous four are all absolutely stunning books, and The Air Year is no different. And if you're going to kind of go and read any poet off the back of this one, then make it be Caroline Bird, because she's bloody marvelous. So what Caroline Bird does, again, we've got a kind of surrealist link here. Caroline Bird's also a kind of quite a surreal poet, but she uses objects. She takes these objects, and she kind of places them in scenarios, and uses them, I guess, in a way that we'd be more familiar with as prose writers, perhaps, and that she uses them as metaphor, particularly in this poem. And this is a poem called Rope Bridges, and let's give it a read, shall we, before we do something with it. Rope Bridges. Your land of love consists mainly of rope bridges, crisscrossing the sky like a cat's cradle, strung between mountains. For each time you've moved on, gotten over something, a rope bridge hangs as testament, the last remaining thread of a thought. Some are 25 years old, woven from doll's hair and nettles. Some are wholesome and beautiful, vines planted on opposite sides of the river, naturally grown to span the gap and weave together. Some are elaborate, pre-planned, constructed under high tension, and enshrined with laminated photographs. The latest is narrow and rickety, but you're crossing in style. I look up from my inflatable raft to see you gliding above me, passing into a cloud. Okay. So I think the reason I put this poem last is I think it takes all of those things that we've looked at so far, and it kind of puts them into one poem. We've got this idea of intensely noticing these rope bridges, what they're made of, how old they are, what they're spanning. We've got the idea that there's a sense that there's a visual equivalence being sought here. The kind of there's a couple of little bits of internal rhyme, that are kind of where where we've got the opposite sides of the river naturally grown to span the gap and weave together. There's a kind of rhythm there, quite a nice kind of way in which that river and together kind of rhyme. So there's a kind of an idea for a visual equivalence going on there. It's also quite playful, like Vic's work is. It's fun, I suppose. And what she really does is she takes that idea of kind of the image, and she pushes it as far as she can possibly go. Caroline Bird's got a kind of an idea of, the poem happens after you think you finished the poem. It's always the bit that kind of where you feel you're pushing it too far, you're going into territory that you wouldn't otherwise go in. That's where the real poem happens. That's where the real writing happens. And certainly for me, I definitely find times where, I hit flow when I'm writing, and it's the stuff that I hadn't expected to write that kind of comes out of nowhere. That's the kind of the really interesting stuff, to me, and that's where the kind of the real fun happens when you read it back, I guess, and you go, where did that come from? So I guess activity four then, is to have a crack at a metaphor poem that takes one idea, one object, and uses it as a metaphor for something, and really pushes it as far as it can go. Create your landscape of past loves or past whatevers, out of whatever object you want to. You can steal Caroline's first line. I'm sure she won't mind. Your land of love. Or you can change love for something else. Your land of, I don't know, any other abstract verb, I guess. Your land of past, griefs or loss or joys or whatever it is you want to talk about. But pick an object, really go as far as you can, I guess. And again, I guess what we're kind of trying to aim for here is that the object is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. I mean, at no point does Caroline Bird describe why past loves might be like rope bridges, or why some of those rope bridges might be made out of doll's hair and nettles. I mean, what possible love might we have got over and left for the rope bridge that it leaves behind to be made of doll's hair and nettles? Um, and the poem's better for not explaining that. Like I said, description of objects is where we can let the reader in. It's where we can let somebody in to kind of go, well, to me that means this, and they can be kind of more so than we are as writers. It's the reader who does the job of constructing the meaning there, really. Not to go down the whole kind of, the author is dead kind of route, but the reader's got to do a lot of the heavy lifting here, and it's the object that kind of allows them into the poem to do that. So um with that one, the last kind of activity where you're writing your landscape of lost loves, or whatever it is you're writing a landscape of, don't explain too much, just let the objects do the work. And kind of, yeah, avoid that kind of tendency that I think we all get pulled towards quite often, to kind of to try to over explain ourselves. Um, just if we're describing the objects clearly, if we're noticing intently, and we're kind of maybe trying to use that, some of that visual equivalence, and we're kind of really pushing the objects as far as they can go, then the meanings will be there anyway. And how exciting, right? When it's kind of comes up with a meaning that isn't one that we brought um, to the table, and just one that kind of pops up somewhere else. Right. Okay. That, I think, is it. I think we've done about 20 minutes. So kind of four activities there for you to kind of have a go at elsewhere. Yeah. Yeah. Have fun. It would be brilliant if if you do kind of get anything out of these poems. Stick them up online if you want to. Tag me, tag Camp YA. I'd love to have a read. It'd be brilliant to see what we kind of come up with. That'd be fantastic.
Hey, Luke, do you think I could ask you a few questions?
Absolutely can.
Okay. I guess the first one that I've received is, what is your favorite poem?
Oh, blimey. My favourite poem is probably one that I kind of probably that one that but the poem that I first fell in love with, actually. Is a poem by a guy called Robert Hass. And I came to poetry quite late, I think, comparatively to some other poets that are working today. It was the summer after university. I was working at a language school in Oxford. I wandered into a bookshop, picked a book off the shelf at random, and the first poem is a poem called Happiness by a poet called American poet called Robert Hass, which is absolutely beautiful. And it's still, I think, probably most of that his collection, which is called Sun Underwood, is probably up there in my top 10. There's another one in there called Butterflies Mating, Dragonflies Mating, sorry, which is absolutely beautiful as well. But yeah, Robert Hass is probably the winner of that one.
Mm. Oh, and you lived in Oxford. Good choice.
Yeah, I was only there for the summer. Yeah, just a
Ah,
tourist, basically. But yeah, just here. Yeah.
a few of us Camp YAers, we have a connection to Oxford. I lived there for several years as a Demet, so yeah,
Cool. No,
Oxford's
it's
a
beautiful,
great
beautiful town.
place.
Yeah, yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. When did you start writing poetry?
I used to write. I know it's not the same thing, but I used to write a lot of song lyrics when I was kind of 13, 14, 15. And I guess that was the beginning of it, really, I suppose. Before that, I used to play around with kind of stories, short stories, bore my parents rigid with, oh, can you read this? I wrote this story. Um, but yeah, so probably song lyrics were what started it when I was about, yeah, in my kind of early teens. But I think I probably started writing poetry properly. I say properly, kind of when I started reading poetry, which I think is one of the vital things if you want to write poetry, is to read as much of it as you can. That was probably in my early 20s, really. So I've probably been, yeah, 10, 15 years now writing poetry, I would say. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Was this encouraged in school? Did you find your experience learning poetry in school helped or hindered you?
Um, at school, I was always of the mind that, I didn't want to be told what to think about a poem, man. I was always that, like, the man, the institution is going to tell me what to think about a poem, and that's not what poetry is about, yeah. So now as an English teacher, I'm kind of on the flip side of that, and I try as much as I possibly can to like not give a kind of fixed reading of a poem, because I think that's what differs. I think that's the major difference between poetry and prose, is that poetry should be open to interpretation. It should have several directions you can take the poem in. So it wasn't that enamored I made poetry education. It was only when I kind of came back to it afterwards. And again, I didn't take English literature at A level for that reason, because I got the impression from the teachers that were teaching it that it was going to be a bit more. I was going to be dictated at in terms of kind of how to see things, really, how to see the works in front of me. And I didn't want to do that. So yeah, but at the same time, I was reading a lot of poetry in the library. Kind of fell in love with Dylan Thomas when I was doing my A levels, and he was kind of the first, one of the first poets that I read a lot of. I didn't understand any of it, but it sounded bloody marvelous. So that was good fun. So I wasn't I didn't have that brilliant a poetry education, really. Um, I think it's kind of only by reading other people's sleeve and beyond that it's really really hit me.
Yeah, I also had a mixed bag of experiences in school.
Yeah, I don't think
But a few of those
schools in
poems have like stuck with me. So
yeah. I can remember some Philip Larkin from school and things like that. But again, I don't think schools have a great track record with poetry because poetry and exams just don't go together. They're just poetry doesn't live in exams. Like I don't think it should be kind of
there's no
there
right
isn't always a
answer.
with poetry. No, exactly, and you know, and yeah, it's a difficult thing to kind of balance against the demands of of the curriculum that doesn't necessarily need to lead to an exam at the end. Is to kind of stick a poem in there. Yeah, it's hard work for teachers in that regard. And then to kind of keep the whole poetry thing, you know, as alive as possible. Really, it's yeah, the two aren't they're not great bedfellows.
Yeah. Um, about your writing, I've
Mm.
been asked by someone in our audience, was writing your novel different to writing your more standalone poetry?
Yeah, it was a lot. You can the word "get away with" is wrong. That's the wrong thing to say. But I felt like I was getting away with a lot more when I was writing prose, or when I'm writing prose rather. You can go for longer. You can you the poetry. The whole one of the principles behind my poetry is that you can kind of you you start with stuff and then you kind of compress it down and condense it down and you get rid of everything that isn't absolutely necessary to the poem. Whereas prose is kind of the opposite of that, in that you build up the world rather than kind of shrink it right down to its barest essentials. I mean, there are moments in my novel that in Grow where that poetry technique kind of really helped, like where there's a few chapters and a few bits of dialogue and a few scenes that are really stripped back. But for the most part, yeah, it's a lot more. I could play around a lot more, I felt, with prose than I can with poetry, and leave a lot more on the page, I think. So I think the poetry helps, particularly at the editing stage. It's really, really useful just to kind of, I think, I've killed so many darlings in poetry that, kind of, I had no qualms about knocking vast chunks of the novel out. So yeah, that helps, but it is quite a different experience, and it's I'm finding it easier to switch between the two nowadays, but it is quite difficult to kind of to write with kind of both hats on at the same time.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at LC Palmer Poet on Twitter, or I'm on Instagram at Luke the Palmer as well. And yeah, that's probably the best two places to get hold of me, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And everyone go check out Luke's work. Yeah, thanks, and see everyone in the next event.
Real. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along.